All right, we're reconvening our morning meeting with a conversation on fragmentation and parcelization with Jamie Fidel, General Counsel and Forest and Wildlife Program Director at VNRC. Sounds like you, Jamie.
Unmute in the Zoom.
It's up in the top down, maybe.
There's a lot of you on the screen too.
You've got a team.
It's fixed. Go to share screen.
So stay muted.
Oh, no.
There's so many of him on the screen. Camera. You need to turn off your video. Yeah. Okay.
Turn off the video too.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I think it's okay now, but
If I do that, then I can't share the screen.
no, you're good. Leave it the way it is. Share screen, and now we're good. We can see it up there.
I know. I'm trying.
You did that last year too.
I was not sitting
Or the
next
year
to you
before.
last year.
Okay.
All right, team, we're live. Great.
I'm not complaining.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me this morning. It's good to be here and to be in committee at meet returning and new members. So I'm Jamie Fidel. I'm the Forest and Wildlife Program Director at Vermont Natural Resources Council and General Counsel. I've been at VNRC for over 20 years now. And so just realizing that I've been there for a third of the time that VNRC has existed. We're celebrating our 60th anniversary. Very quickly, for those of you who don't know about Vermont Natural Resources Council, we're a nonprofit organization. We're located just down the street. We've been active here in the State House since the beginning, and we were started by farmers and foresters who were concerned about a potential direction that Vermont was going in when there started to be some pretty intense development, especially in southern Vermont at the time. And they were interested in holding on to what makes Vermont a unique and rural place. So we've been across the years working across a number of programs, and hopefully you'll get to meet my colleagues. Katie Gallagher works on sustainable communities and housing issues, John Groveman on water quality issues, Joey Miller on climate and energy. So there's a number of us who will be tracking their work and available to help out as needed if you're like any input from us. I think this picture says a lot of what the work that we do and the work that I do, in particular in the forest program. It was really great having Eric before me, because early on in my tenure at the NRC, he approached me when there was a lot of debates about forest management going on in the Green Mountain National Forest, and things were getting fractured about how to manage lands. And he said, listen, there's an issue that I think VNRC should be engaged in. And that's, we need to kind of keep forest as forest, period. Like, how do we work on that? How do we actually address forest fragmentation? And I really listened to him and a number of other people. And I actually started to make that the basis of my work plan. And I'm going to explain some of that background and some of the work that's been going on statewide. But I do credit Eric actually for my work on forest fragmentation. There's a couple different ways to look at this issue in some different terms. And Eric did a nice primer of talking about, some issues related to this. There's outright forest loss. That just means the forests are sort of converted and are no longer there or functioning. And the Forest Service tracks that at a federal level through the forest inventory and analysis. Commissioner Fitzko mentioned some of those statistics here the other day, and you were talking about that a little bit. It changes every year. It's an estimate based on a 5 to 10 year average. The latest report that just came out estimates that we're losing about 12,650 acres are converted. So that's they're gone. It's been converted to development. It's also worth noting that 74% of our state is covered by forests. Heavy land clearing at the turn of the century, like 100 years ago plus, for sheep grazing and heavy land clearing. lots of logs being sent down to Connecticut River. We have the success story of reforesting our state. I think we're upwards, I'm not sure if I've got this right, but we may have even hit somewhere up closer to 80%. We're now in a decline. So every year we are now losing our forests. We're no longer on that trajectory up. We're going down. So this is forest fragmentation. I think this slide just kind of is a good visual. And I want to preface that this is just something that happens in Vermont, happens across the country as we develop. And my presentation is not to say that VNRC is anti-development. It's how we develop. It's how do we do it in a way that maintains the values and the functions, our land use goals in the state. And how do we maintain sort of our rural lands, both for economic reasons and ecological reasons. So as I do my work across the state, a lot of it's focused on land use. And I just thought it'd be helpful. This is in my town, Waitsfield, a couple of examples of forest fragmentation that's happening from development. So this is a road going in here up into the Northfield Range. And you can see the extent of that, the impact of that one road in house. Again, here's another example here. This is Vermont conservation design. This area in the middle is sort of considered important forest block. And you see this one road in development going into the heart of it. And here's another example further up north around Eden. Another example. So these are just visuals to show you. And again, this happens, this is within landowners' property rights, but it's just a visual of the types of fragmenting impact that we see in Vermont. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because Eric gave you the foundation of Vermont conservation design, which started with actually habitat block assessment, or a forest block assessment was the precursor. But this map on the right is really telling. I think actually Eric provided this to me years ago. Shows Vermont if we don't have any roads or houses. And then if we put in our roads and we overlay our houses, you can see sort of where the development's happening. So this is really interesting because it shows you, for one, that we have fragmentation of our landscape happening, and we have a lot of still large intact forest blocks left. So that's just sort of a visual of what's the cumulative effect over time and the opportunities that we have as well. So parcelization is sort of more the breaking up of land into smaller parcels through subdivision. So fragmentation is sort of that incursion into the forest, sort of like the physical incursion. Parcelization is more like legally, like landowners decide I'm going to subdivide my land. There's going to be more parcels from a parent parcel than there's going to be, kind of referred to as parent-child parcels. There's going to be increasing parcels that are created. And what that means from sort of like a forest integrity perspective is there's more owners of this, the same amount of land, but there's just more and more forest land owners. What kinds of decisions are they making about their land? It's usually sort of the precursor then to some development that's going to happen over time. And how it happens is really the question. It's not to say that we're not going to have subdivision, just how does it happen? And what does it mean? What are the patterns? Usually means less viability for forestry. The more and more we're continuing to parcelize and have smaller and smaller parcels, they're harder to manage and to provide get access to do good forestry. And there's a whole host of potentially negative effects that scientific community have documented. So these are just some of the different terms that we've been tracking parcelization. We created this website based on grand list information. And it's available at our website. I could quickly take you there, but I'm just going to show you that we've actually done sort of 4 rounds of this. So we started in 2010. We actually looked at what were the trends from 2003 to 2009 to get a statewide snapshot, and we made the data available so at the county level, regional planning level, statewide level, and townwide level. And we did some case study of subdivisions in 22 towns. I'll talk about that in a minute. In 2018, we kind of did a much larger snapshot. I'm going to share some of those trends, and I'm going to talk to you about what we're doing right now. Let me just see if I can quickly do this.
Mhm.
No, I'm not going to bother doing that.
Good God.
I had hopes for that. I'm not going to share websites with you. We're going to stay right here. All right. So I mentioned, just to give you this foundation, let me cut to phase 3, because that kind of gives you a long snapshot. Right now, we're updating to go through 2020. I just don't have the data available just yet for you. It's coming very soon. So in 2016, it was roughly 3,350,000 acres. Over 70% of the land were in parcels 50 acres or larger. So through work that we've done with a lot of colleagues, 50 acres is just seen as sort of a viable tract of forest if you're going to manage for forestry, working forest. It's not that we don't have smaller parcels, current use enrollment smaller. It's just a way of looking at how are we doing as far as maintaining larger parcels versus smaller. So it's an arbitrary number. It was just one that we collected from input from a lot of different people. The grand list, as you know, is used for property tax purposes, but we decided to see how could we use it to understand land use trends in the state. And so there are different classifications. And one of them is residential, meaning there's a dwelling, there's a house on that land. The woodland category means it's undeveloped forest land. So it's just a way of us collecting that property tax information and saying, how much land are we maintaining in an undeveloped forested state in Vermont? And as you can see, about a quarter is in that classification. So there are large parcels of forest land in Vermont, but they may have a house on it. Just different ways of collecting information and looking at it. What's interesting is that when we looked at that trend period, it was woodland. It was the undeveloped forest land category that was declining at the most rapid clip. And we've been seeing farmland decline, due to conversion as well. The residential obviously is increasing because we're continuing to have more homes on land in Vermont. So that's just a way of tracking the increasing amount of residential land. But what was alarming to us, and we didn't know what the trends would be when we started this project, was just how much the woodland parcel was category was decreasing. Now, a portion of that, maybe 2 to 3%, we think could be just the way that the land is classified. If land goes into public ownership, that may be part of the woodland decrease just by the way that it's in the grand list. Okay. So it's not that we maybe 15%, it's not saying that 15% of our forests were lost. It was just that they went from being undeveloped woodland to now having woodland with houses or dwellings on it.
We have a question from Representative Smith.
Thank you. Can you tell me why you wouldn't have something more updated than 2016? It's 6 years or 7 years ago.
Yeah, we've asked same thing. We are updating it. And it was my goal to come here today and give you that data. But we work with a team of folks and we're just waiting for that data to be scrubbed. There were some anomalies in there that was being cleaned up. It's a big, ambitious project. The grand list is not necessarily used for this purpose. So there's a lot of data quality control. I'm happy to come back and share that with you. Just
I'd love to see a map where you might be up to like 2020 or 2021.
Yeah.
Like that.
And I was going to show you the website. If you go to VNRC.org, you can go to the Parcelization project website and you can actually look in your town and you can see all these different metrics of percentage change over time and lots of different information, both at the regional, county, statewide level. And
But also only to 2016.
to 2016, yeah. So soon it'll be up to 2020, and then our hope is every year we can automate it and get us closer to where we are once the data is available. We really wanted to understand sort of spatially what's going on with subdivisions too. That's grand list data. It doesn't tell you like spatially where each subdivision is happening. It just gives you an aggregate amount of information at a town level or countywide level. So we did a phase 2 and we actually looked at, we did 22 case study towns. We went into each town and combed through their subdivision records to understand a little bit more about subdivision trends in Vermont. Again, this was a previous study to look through 2002 to 2009. We wanted to know how many lots were being created, how is subdivision happening? So in those 22 case study towns, there were over 2,700 lots created from 925 subdivisions.
Representative Sibilia.
So I am on that website and I'm looking at the towns and
Yeah.
I'm seeing some big fat zeros, like maybe there's no data.
And it's as I said before,
I'd say 22 towns.
it's not a perfect, But this was a smaller subset, and I'd be glad to kind of work with you on understanding the data in your town.
Yeah.
Sort of offline. And there will be some anomalies in there. It's not, the grant list isn't perfect for this. So I'm gonna tell you about some other tools that we're actually building now, which we think are gonna be more accurate. So what was interesting is on average, each subdivision in these case study towns, and these were diverse towns. It wasn't just one type of town, like, a rural town versus more of like a resort area. We had a diverse spectrum to a UVM.
Make sure I'm following. Was this in 22 towns? This was your sample size for
is
this?
Just
Okay.
22 towns, the amount of subdivisions that were tracked over like a 7 or 8 year period, just to give you a snapshot. And what we could glean out of that is we looked at so on average, each subdivision was 2 to 4 lots. And then based on some spatial analysis, we were able to do, this is the beginning of trying to understand if there were digital parcel maps available for the town, could we understand spatially where the subdivision's happening? Are they happening in areas where we, from a land use perspective, encourage a lot of growth? Is it happening in our sort of rich rural lands? And what it showed is that, 50 to close to 70% were located in the forest blocks that sort of Eric was showing you that the A&R had mapped. Size-wise, majority were not triggering Act 250. 1 to 2% of those subdivisions were large enough to trigger Act 250. Okay, so what we saw was a very small percentage of these developments going through our statewide development review, which means the local process is really important to shape how that development happens. Now, there's a smaller number of subdivisions that were already under Act 250, and then they continue to trigger Act 250. So there is, more acreage that happens through that. But as far as new subdivisions being created on the land, think of them as pretty small, and then it's a cumulative effect over time. This just shows you sort of the median size. A little more information from that. This starts to show you that once parcels that are of a larger size are pretty good at retaining still a larger parcel through the subdivision process. Once you sort of get down into 50 to 100 acres, you're going to start getting less and less, viable parcels for sort of maintaining, a lot of forest functions. And then we've got more and more multiple owners. And then we looked at, where is it happening? Or is the development happening in sort of like natural resource related conservation districts? Is it happening in more of like the default areas where you see a lot of development, like our rural residential districts or agricultural residential districts? And what we found is the majority of subdivisions were happening in those rural residential districts. So we don't know if that means those conservation districts are on steep slopes or they're more prohibitive as far as the kinds of development. But what we are seeing is that acknowledge this is where a lot of the subdivisions are happening. And then we started looking at what are those areas then equipped to kind of address forest fragmentation, for example. Okay, so this gets to your question. We are now knee deep in trying to update this to 2020. And we've been working with Deb Brighton, who's a tax expert in the state, does a lot of work for the legislature and joint fiscal. She's brilliant, and she's figured out different ways to kind of tease out this information.
Representative Torrey.
Yeah.
Well, just before you move, of the 22 case study towns, how many of them had subdivision regulations?
We were able to track their subdivision records. I'll have to get back to you and look at that. I want to say that all of them did, and that's how you part of it, but it may not necessarily. Sort of like what was available in the records. I forget if that was part of our methodology. I'll look. That report is also available on our website. So what I want to share here is that I can come back and report where we are in 2020. Sort of there was a cusp of accelerated activity, as we all know, during sort of COVID migration time. Beginning in 2020, we want to try and capture what that looks like. What Deb pointed out, though, is, perhaps we should be looking at the property transfer tax returns because they actually have more information that may be relevant to subdivisions. And through our work on this project and work with the tax department, we're on the cusp of and they're been very cooperative in basically saying, are there any tweaks to how we collect information in our property transfer returns to actually allow us to track subdivision better, like spatially, like the parent-child parcels, the parcels that are actually created through subdivision, through those returns. It's really promising. And we think that may be a better tool to build into the future. And I'm going to share with you a case study that we did just in Addison County, where Deb was able to look at the records there. She wanted me to clarify that she was not able to capture every subdivision because there, again, no data set is perfect for these land use applications, but she said it was pretty good. She's able to capture the majority of them. And this just gives you an idea of how we can now, the next frontier is looking at this spatially to understand where are we subdividing in Vermont. Our goal is to build this tool for the entire state. All we have is a case study in Addison County right now. We looked at 2018 to 21 for the case study. And so this shows you how many parcels are in Addison County. And there were 125 parcels that were subdivided. This map is also showing you where those subdivisions were located and the size of them, acreage wise, which allows us then to start getting into some land use sort of analysis. So one thing is, there's future land use maps. That's at the regional, planning commission level as designated for the kinds of uses that are anticipated for different areas of land. And so what this is really interesting is it's kind of showing that 69% of the subdivisions happened in either rural and agricultural or forest land and conservation sort of related areas. So it's sort of consistent with what I was telling you before on our case studies, that we're seeing subdivisions happening more in our rural areas, not necessarily more in our denser developed areas. And then if we want to know, like for forest blocks, what's happening, 91% of those subdivisions intersected intact forest blocks. So this is just another tool for us to understand how development is happening in Vermont. And I think what it's showing is that a lot of it is happening in our rural lands. And so that has, an impact as we look at maintaining the integrity of our natural resources, integrity of our forests, and also address the housing crisis, because we're going to continue to see subdivision in Vermont.
Representative Stebbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jamie, do you care to opine as to whether or not part of the reason why we're seeing more of that subdivision in the rural areas compared to in downtown villages is because perhaps there's less requirements for how you develop out there?
So it's a really, it's a really important question. And I think it's like sort of the continuing work that we need to do, because I'm sharing with you sort of preliminary data just on this topic without us having published a report yet. And we're going to try and get into that a little bit more when we publish the report and talk with our steering committee about sort of analyzing why these trends, what can we suggest is happening. So can't say I have the magic silver bullet answer for you today, but we're interested in that question. I'm going to kind of gloss over this. Maybe you've seen some of the, I don't think it's a mystery to all of you that we've seen, we're in a different time in the last couple of years. It's been unprecedented as far as the challenges we've been dealing with, and also the interest of sort of land transfers and people moving to Vermont, and there's accelerated land values are going up. Housing is decreasing as far as availability. We've got some really interesting challenges and trends, and this just shows you so this is using the property transfer information to show what was going on in 2020 with the spikes in residential property sales to out-of-state buyers. It's really interesting when you look at this, where is it happening? And you look at Southern Vermont sort of lighting up, and other areas, obviously, in Vermont. And the land valuation is going up. And I'm not going to go to the website. I was going to. If you go to VCGI's parcel, sort of their analysis, you can see what I was going to show is the land values are just going through the roof across every county in Vermont over the last couple of years. And the reason I wanted to mention that is because I think we're aware of what this means for somebody who's trying to buy an affordable house or live in Vermont. It also means it's harder for people to hold on to raw land or undeveloped land because of the land valuation. And if they're not in current use program, they're paying a lot of property taxes on that undeveloped land. And we're concerned about landowners' ability to hold on to undeveloped land and maintain those functions in light of rising property values. So we're looking at both sides of the equation.
So actually, I have a question. It says property sales and COVID migration. Do you know that those folks have moved here?
So I should clarify that I put in COVID migration because our sense is this is a COVID climate migration dynamic, but not entirely. So to be clear, that's not the way the state or BCGI was clarifying it.
You don't know if people are living in those properties. You just assuming it. It's like those are the sales.
Yeah, and I'm about to get into a project we're developing to try and answer more of those questions. It hasn't always been easy through this data. We've worked with Deb to clarify the location of these landowners and the status of what's going on in those homes, but I just wanted to pause because I wasn't sure if there was a question.
Yeah.
So just noting, I do think that a lot of that is real, based on what I see.
I'm not saying it's not real. We just don't know.
No, just I live in a purple town.
Yeah.
So in terms of are they staying?
Mm.
But I would also note that some of those, a lot of those places that I'm seeing, particularly in southern Vermont, those are areas with big tourism, big ski areas. And so those are much different when we're thinking about, they're just really different. The real estate markets are very different there than they are in places where there are more jobs, more year-round jobs. So in our densely populated urban areas. So
And there's no doubt if you look at this list that there's a correlation with resort related areas for a lot of these towns, ski areas in particular. So it's, yeah.
sales is not necessarily new construction either, I would note.
Right. And that's what we're trying to build is an understanding of how to link transfers and then understand how much the transfers are then leading the subdivision. So we're trying to build all of these tools to help us understand what's going on. This is a new project that's going to help. This just was funded by the Forest Service through their landscape scale restoration in partnership with the Agency of Natural Resources, FPR, Fish and Wildlife Department, Vermont Coverts, Vermont Woodlands Association, and Deb Brighton. One of the things we're developing for this project is a database of new parcel or new transfers. So who over the last couple of years. So who are the new forest landowners in Vermont? Are they from out of state? Are they in-state owners? Just thought it was interesting that over the last couple of years, we're seeing over 6,000 transfers on parcels that are over 10 acres in size. So we've got a database now where we have 18,000 potentially, new parcel owners, and they're not from all out of state. Some of them just were in Vermont and they bought a new parcel. But the question is now from a landowner outreach perspective, getting to Eric's point of how critical private landowners are in Vermont. Who are these landowners and how much forest land do they own? And do they know about the available stewardship and conservation opportunities that exist in the state, like current use, for example, or conservation easements, or they thought about doing any successional planning for the future of their forest based on looming intergenerational transfer that Jameson referenced. But there's been reports that the legislature has convened. We have a very old demographic of forest landowner on average in Vermont, and those parcels are going to change ownership. And if they haven't planned for the future of those parcels, it's really easy to just subdivide them up among the heirs as an easy legal way to sort of deal with, for the executor of that parcel. So that's another issue that's been recognized by the legislature. I don't want to dwell on this project other than to say we're going to have a pretty intense outreach effort and develop a decision road making map and guide for stewardship and conservation opportunities to direct technical assistance to 100 landowners, mailings to 5,000. So, but the database is going to be interesting too. And we're trying to tease out more of that information as far as the changed parcels, like the ownership.
Jamie,
Yeah.
I actually have a question. I know your slide had it, but what if there are 6,000 transfers? Is that in the past year?
That was
Annual?
So just like last year, there were over 6,000.
And before COVID, what was an average year?
I'd have to go back and look at that because
I thought your slide.
This is a database of transfers. And so Deb only looked at the last 3 years. So if you wanted to go back further, we'd have to do that analysis.
But did it increase over those 3 years?
On average, the last 3 years had over 6,000 at 10 acres or more. I have to go back further to say how much is that a spike?
Yeah, I'm just curious how much of it is like Representative Sibilia.
No,
also.
I'm going to pass actually. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, I'm going to get into more than sort of, this is just a snapshot of some projects that we've been working on. I want to also talk about where there's been strategy and policy recommendations being developed across the state. So going back to 2006, we convened a forest roundtable to address parcelization and fragmentation. That was right around the time I was talking with Eric about fragmentation, and the way we started was to convene a statewide discussion with really diverse stakeholders. So this was not just conservation people, this was forest landowners, woodland organizations, state, federal agencies, people that in the forest products industry, rural economic development interest, Vermont Council on Rural Development, list goes on and on. You can look at the report, see the people who are participated. We came out with a number of recommendations. Since 2006, we've had over 50 meetings on this issue and forest policy in general. And so it's been a consistent sort of ongoing dialogue among diverse stakeholders to talk about the future of forests. We came out with this report, which had 27 strategies to address parcelization and fragmentation with buckets of categories, like tax policy is really important, land use and conservation planning, sort of how we value ecosystem services, carbon, all of those things, and the long-term sort of viability or sustainability of the forest products industry. As we looked at addressing fragmentation, it was sort of a Big 10 approach. So working lands are part of this. How do we keep forest intact and functioning? And that includes a whole spectrum of important sort of management choices, everything from passive to active management. It's simply how do we keep forests as forests over time? These are the recommendations. I don't have time to go through them. Can send the report to you. This was back in 2006, our thinking of the leading recommendations to address fragmentation and parcelization. So the report's available. And it was really interesting. The legislature got really interested in forest fragmentation, and the Agency of Natural Resources started doing some really premium work on this issue. Commissioner Snyder in particular had sort of this seminal, I remember, I don't know if any of you were in the room when he presented this 2015 forest fragmentation report downstairs to, I forget how many committees.
I was there.
It felt like it was a watershed moment because it just like opened a lot of our eyes to sort of what was going on in our forests. It was a really excellent report. And then there were two more reports after that, continuing work on recommendations to address fragmentation, both on the regulatory side, a whole bunch of non-regulatory options. All these reports have been the basis of then legislation that has tried to be passed over the years, as Eric was saying, to kind of address where some of the gaps are. And there are a lot of gaps in the state. We've been looking at them, but as Eric mentioned, Act 250 is one of them. It doesn't have really a functioning criteria to shape how development happens in forests, while so many other natural resource related criteria do function relatively well. We're missing the boat when it comes to forest, as far as large subdivisions that are going through Act 250. There was the Commission on Act 250 report where these issues were very much in play and under consideration. Just want to highlight here that there was acknowledgement, that addressing fragmentation is really important in Act 250. And in the discussions that we're not sort of meeting our goals for, settlement patterns that we have in our land use goals and statute. And we do need to sort of address fragmentation, in Act 250. So the Act 250 Commission report highlighted that, as well as sort of understanding how can we look at different, tiers or jurisdictional approaches in Act 250 to try and maybe figure out what are the most critical areas where we need to take maybe a more intense review of the impacts, where there are areas, how do we maintain our sort of forest in general from a site design perspective, where are areas that we may want to streamline and eliminate some of the redundancy, I guess, is how some people talk about it. So that's in this report. And so these issues have been around for years, being debated here. There's been legislation to try and create new criteria in Act 250. It hasn't gotten across the finish line yet, even though the legislature has strongly supported it and passed it out in various bills. Unfortunately, they haven't been supported by the governor yet, but we do hope one day that we can actually have comprehensive Act 250 reform. This is one component of it. I want to touch on the climate action plan for a minute, because I think it's really important how much the plan actually recognized the important role of forest because of the role that forests play in sequestering and storing carbon. It's actually really stark the way that they talk about this trend that we're seeing in Vermont, that our sequestration rates are actually in decline. And they talk about the need to understand that. I think part of it is because we're losing forests and we're losing the amount of forests that we have to sequester, store carbon. And what they said in the climate action plan is if this trend continues, the state will not meet our net zero target, even if emission reduction targets are achieved. So what this puts into question is we can make progress in our greenhouse gas reductions. And if we continue to ignore what's going on with forest land loss and the conversion of our forests, we're getting way behind in our ability to actually meet our goals. So we have to figure out how to sort of pay attention to this issue.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. And I know we've had this discussion, but I just want to kind of put a pin here and say strong supporter of Global Warming Solutions Act and our climate action plan. The framing of our work here is really important to me around adaptation, much more so than emissions reduction, though that is what the Global Warming Solutions Act does. It does put our emissions reduction goals in statute, but I think it's really imperative for us, for those we represent, and for Vermonters in order to understand how this impacts them. And so just the imperative when we're talking about sequestration, I think is not necessarily immediately apparent to Vermonters on how it impacts their ability to live in this state and adapt to climate change. So
The plan has so many different policies related to forests, both from like an emissions perspective, like the carbon sequestration storage, but also that we have to maintain a resilient landscape to deal with the changes that we're going to see to our forest, and wildlife's ability to adapt. Our ability to maintain sort of functioning forests, both economically and ecologically, is really important to sort of, it's an important piece of the puzzle. So I'm just flagging here that it was encouraging to see, a key strategy identified, both parts of this land use coin, as they put it, right? How do we deal with housing? How do we deal with the crisis and compact settlement development? How do we deal with the increasing fragmentation of our forest land? It matters from a climate perspective.
A question from Representative Smith.
Thank you. We've got a lot, I think the state probably is the biggest landowner in the state of Vermont. Would you agree with me or disagree with me on that?
No, I actually don't know if the Green Mountain National Forest is 400,000 acres. So
The state has 6.
I'm thinking more in
600
Northeast Kingdom.
okay, that could be.
There's a lot of state and federally owned land out there.
Mhm.
Would you consider, I know 20 years ago, you needed 4-wheel drives to drive anywhere you wanted to go in some of the back roads. The state and feds have improved these roads to the point where you could drive a rear wheel drive Corvette anywhere you wanted to go. Would you consider that fragmentation by allowing those roads to be a lot more accessible to any mode of transportation?
It's been interesting, those definitions have been considered here in the legislature, different like various efforts, and like forestry roads haven't been considered really a fragmenting feature. It's more like permanent roads that are going in that are, paved. That's how I think, the state forest blocks are sort of identifying where the forest blocks are. So I think it depends on sort of like intensity and the use of it. And I think, this could be a whole conversation. So we could talk more about that.
If
But
the use had tripled in the last 10 years, would you say that was fragmentation?
recreational in general, recreational sort of trails and use, forestry has not been where the policy has focused as far as addressing fragmentation. There may be different scientists that have different explanations for you about the fragmenting impact of different uses and their intensities. So it can be sort of complicated depending on how you.
Oh, it's complicated, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to keep on moving here. So again, climate action plan was looking at how to update Act 250 as another option. I do want to highlight that when the legislature acts, it can have a really positive effect. So this was a major effort, Chair Sheldon was part of, and implement Act 171. And there was a forest omnibus bill. It had a lot of provisions in it, some to help sort of maintain working forests. This particular provision related to planning and actually adding a goal in our state for municipalities and regional planning commissions, a required goal to actually identify important forest blocks and the connectivity areas between them, and to plan to try and minimize the fragmentation of these areas. So Fish and Wildlife Department is really good at offering technical assistance to municipalities to understand where those areas are. And I just wanted to highlight that we have a project to actually measure the success of these kinds of policies. So in joint partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Department, Jens Hilke and Andy Wood in particular did great work. We worked on this to actually review every town plan, zoning, and subdivision bylaw. We do it every 10 years. There's a number of natural resource related metrics. It's a huge endeavor. And we just kind of want to understand what's going on at the municipal level, because we talk about sort of statewide policy and land use development review at Act 250 and where there are gaps, but a lot of, it's the rubber hits the road really sort of, and how municipalities are addressing forest land or wildlife conservation. So this report came out just recently last year.
Representative Sibilia has a question.
Just a quick question. Do you provide them feedback, or is it just for your own, do you just intake the information, or do you provide anything back?
To municipalities?
Yeah.
We had webinars where we're inviting planning commission and conservation commissions and land use planners in the state to talk about the trends and share it.
Okay.
And the regional planning commissions. And yeah.
That's amazing.
And that dialogue's ongoing too. We don't just, we try and talk about it, and act on it. I could come back and so much information in this report that's relevant to your committee's jurisdiction. I just wanted to show you sort of an addressing fragmentation in the Act 171 measure, look at the improvement in attention to these issues at the town planning level. So this is a huge success. Just raising awareness is a huge success. And that was because of the legislature shining a spotlight on this. Whole bunch of metrics on Act 171 and how municipalities are going about implementing it. And what I want to show here is then, well, does that translate to anything on the ground? Because the town plan's aspirational, but does it do anything for the development review process then when development's going through the process? We have different ways of looking at that in the report. I don't have a lot of time today, so I'm just going to show you sort of going back to that issue we we're looking at before. If a lot of development's happening in rural residential districts, and that's, most towns have those districts. Very few have standards to address forest fragmentation. More natural resource related ones do, like wildlife overlay districts, but there's only a few percentage of towns that do it. So the take home message here is that there are some towns that are starting to address fragmentation, but they're not necessarily doing it where the majority of development's happening or shaping that development. It's sort of like a default standard in areas where there's much less development happening. So there's a whole fascinating conversation we could have about all this. I just wanted to show you, it doesn't always translate then the aspirations into actually influencing something on the ground. Just because this committee now has jurisdiction, it always has over climate issues, but energy in particular. I just want to show you, we also looked at climate change metrics in this, and how towns are doing in addressing climate change through their town plans. And so there's still, there's some recognition, but quite a bit of work to do.
We're going to get warm.
I'm going to go over these really quickly. The key observations are that towns are doing a really good job on the town plan side. there's aspirational, like recognition of both regulatory and non-regulatory solutions. Important forest block areas are being identified through the plans. But as I was saying, this doesn't always translate then into things, impacts on the regulatory side. And that's where more attention is needed right now, is having good siting standards. And, you know, only half of our 55% of towns actually have subdivision regulations. So there's, you know, almost half don't, to shape development and subdivision. We have a couple other resources that are available. We did develop a forest fragmentation action plan many years ago, working with the land use planning community. So to Representative Sebelia's question, how are we working with that community? We actually went through a whole forest fragmentation sort of exercise with them to develop strategies. This is a guidebook that we wrote for municipalities that has a whole menu of strategies to sort of maintain the integrity of forest and wildlife. And then, so I just wanted to say that we know we have lots of policy recommendations for you, and know that you're, I have like 2 slides worth that I could, you know, talk about right now. And I know time is limited. So I could just sort of maybe just take a couple minutes to put these into buckets, and then I'll just stop. Because I know that you often say, well, you know, do you have ideas of what we should do? And we do. And there's take home is there's been so much work on this issue. There's so many reports and so many recommendations. There's no loss of like policy ideas on what to do. You know, we have to look at how to help landowners as far as maintain their land. So that's tax policy. And do we have the right incentives for them to make those decisions? There's the funding side of it. Do we robustly fund VHCB and the Working Lands Enterprise Board and think that, you know, the different you know, pots of money that go towards this work? Do we need to consider new revenue sources? Is it adequate what we have? You know, we talked this morning, you heard about sort of this international effort to conserve 30%, you know, of our land by 2030. H606 from last year was hugely important to promote a conservation planning discussion about how do we hold on to the fabric of our important rural and working lands and natural areas. As I said, do we need more incentives? How do we encourage aggregation of land for landowners to work together and aggregate their land together? There's the forest carbon, you know, work that's been going on in the legislature. There's the successional planning. How do we help equip landowners to make decisions about the future of their land? And that touches on VHCB's forest viability program, Vermont woodlands, and other coverage and technical systems. There was a whole report on the intergenerational transfer of land that was done for the legislature. That's full of great recommendations that could be revisited. There's the Forest Roundtable and A&R reports. There's the current use program. Worked on that last year. I think you all know about the importance of that program and holding this all together. But there are lands that are not enrolled in that program that pay much higher value, and landowners still may have an interest in conserving those lands. So do we have the right policies to help them? There's addressing the gaps in Act 250. Really hope that that can be part of any comprehensive Act 250 reform. We really do need to have a functioning criteria in Act 250 for forest to do good site design. Not to say no to development in forest, but to say it matters how you develop in forest. Let's encourage good site design. I've talked to so many engineers about this, and they say, we know how to do this. It's not like threatening to them. It's just a matter of promoting good planning. There's the RPCs and capacity to boost the Act 171 planning, because that's bearing a lot of fruit, and working on the zoning and subdivision gaps that I mentioned. The whole work of how do we have the incentives for growth in the right areas, and dealing with wastewater infrastructure, water supply. Climate Action Plan has another policy. How do we get at sort of no net loss in our forest land? What does that look like? And then there's all these tracking tools that I shared with you. You know, we need help in funding, sort of maintaining them and building them out. So we could do the spatial analysis work I was talking about statewide with the transfers as sort of the next frontier. So I'm going to stop there and really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. I don't know if there's time for questions. I may have taken too long.
Thank you. That was great. We had some questions along the way. Do members have any final questions?
Look forward to really exploring a lot of this here. Been a great
Me too.
overview.
There's a lot to explore, and just actually remind members that, VNRC, a lot of what Jamie presented is available in depth. And also your slides, did you submit them?
I did.
Oh, great. So
Yeah, I feel like we could spend 2 hours just talking about this slide right here.
recommendations, but I encourage members to go back and review the presentations when you can, because we heard a lot this morning, a lot to learn and take in, and there'll be